Hey everyone. So for this video lecture I'm going to talk about three of the poems that we're reading for the Week 6C Postcolonialism and Multi-Ethnic Britain reading list. So these would be the three poems that we're reading from Caribbean poets for this week. So that's Claude McKay's Old England, Louise Bennett's Colonization in Reverse, and Derek Walcott's A Far Cry from Africa. Obviously, because I'm trying to cover three poems in one video lecture, this is going to be a fairly short discussion of each one. And I'm going to be primarily focused on the way that these poets use language and the way that they construct their relationships to different geographical spaces, especially to Britain, to the Caribbean, and to Africa. Because these are central concerns for post-colonial writers and theorists, is how language is used and how one relates to space. So if we start with Claude McKay's poem, Old England. So McKay is a Jamaican poet. He's one of the first poets to bring Jamaican literature to a really sort of international stage. And he uses a combination of standard English and what we would call Jamaican Patois, which is a sort of Creole dialect, Jamaican, not slang, but it's a dialect of English that combines terms from French and Spanish, terms from indigenous Caribbean cultures, terms from African languages, and then it blends these into a new dialect. And we see this more in Bennett's work than in McKay's, but McKay is one of the first ones who does this and gains a sort of international reputation as a poet. And Old England in particular has a lot of patois as far as McKay's work goes. And we can see this from the very beginning of the poem. I've longing in me depths of heart that I can conquer not. 'Tis a wish that I've been having from since I could form a thought. 'Tis a sail athwart the ocean and to hear the billows roar, when them ride round the steamer, when them beat on England's shore. So we've got clearly non-standard English here. I mean, longin', L-O-N-G-I-N apostrophe, in me depths of heart. So we've got both non-English spelling, dat instead of that, D-A-T, but then we've also got what sounds to standard English speakers as idiosyncratic phrasing. That I can conquer not. That I can conquer not, in line 1 here, sounds very archaic. I mean, it sounds almost like what we typically think of as sort of Elizabethan or Shakespearean language, where we've got these sort of transpositions of words. Because in contemporary standard English, it would be that I cannot conquer. Or 'tis a wish that I've been having since I could form a thought. I guess that's actually fairly standard English. But, I mean, you can go throughout the poem and find these sort of idiosyncratic phrases that are characteristic of a Jamaican dialect rather than a standard English dialect. But then, I mean, contrary-wise, if you look at this poem, If We Must Die, on 2723, which is the Claude McKay poem in here I didn't have you read, this one is written in standard English. So clearly McKay is making a choice here to write this poem about England and about this desire to go to England. He's clearly making a choice to write this in patois. And the way that McKay figures England in this poem is really interesting, because we have a tension here about homeland. So in line 5 he says, "Just to view the homeland England, in the streets of London walk." So there's an early on identification with England or Britain as the cultural homeland, this is the origin point, despite the fact that McKay is Afro-Caribbean. He's from Jamaica. He's descended, at least in part, from Africans who were brought over in slavery. There's still this recognition of England as the homeland. And he identifies all of these important cultural points: St. Paul's Cathedral, the City Temple, Westminster Abbey, and all of these places that are sort of characteristic tourist destinations in England. Very beautiful places. St. Paul's and Westminster Abbey I've been to, very beautiful. But when we get to the last stanza, this identification with England as the homeland becomes complex, because we get these last two lines. "So I'll rest glad and contented in me mine forevermore, when I sail across the ocean back to my own native shore." So we go here from line 5, where England is the homeland, to line 28, the last line of the poem, where the poet persona is returning to his native shore, which presumably is Jamaica. So we have here this tension between England, the homeland, and Jamaica, the native shore, both of which this poet identifies with. And this is part of the tension of post-colonial writing, typically, is this divided self, this self divided between British and Jamaican, or whatever it is, French and Algerian, whatever it is. This self-division. We don't have as much of the self-division of post-colonial writers in Louise Bennett's Colonization in Reverse, but we get a lot more of the Patois. So Bennett is also a Jamaican poet, and she writes more predominantly in Patois than Claude McKay does. There's less of her work that shows up in standard English. And so we get this sort of greater identification with the dialect of Jamaica. And part of what Bennett is responding to in this poem is the massive influx of Afro-Caribbean immigrants into Britain in the 1950s, starting late 40s and going through the early 60s. There was a massive number of West Indians, Jamaicans, Barbadians, Trinidadians, and so on, who migrated to Britain. They were British subjects, and so they came to Britain in search of economic opportunities, jobs, education, and things like that weren't available at the time in the Caribbean. And so Bennett takes this in this sort of ironic direction, because she identifies a pattern. She identifies a reversal of the pattern where white Europeans came to the Caribbean and colonized. She now sees black Caribbeans going to England, and she identifies this as a kind of colonization. And this is the source of humor throughout the play, throughout the poem. And I mean, she says this. This is stanza 2, starting at line 5. "By the hundred, by the thousand, from country and from town, by the shipload, by the plane load, Jamaica is England bound." So again, we've got this sense that almost the whole nation of Jamaica is on its way to colonize Britain. And this is a sort of source of tension in the poem. So, I mean, on the one hand, most of the immigrants who came to Britain came seeking economic opportunities, jobs, and things like this. There's also a section, middle of the page, 2727, where Bennett is talking about people coming to Britain and going on the dole, going on public assistance or welfare. So we've got these sort of ironies in the poem, but then ultimately the sort of moment here, the way that this poem wraps up, but I wonderin' how dem gwon stand colonizing in reverse. This is a sort of meditation on what the immigrant experience is going to be in Britain. Because, I mean, obviously coming from Jamaica, Bennett has a strong sense of what it means to be a colonized person. The British don't. Because, I mean, they haven't been invaded since 1066, or they haven't been conquered since 1066. They have, in fact, been the conquerors for most of history since the Middle Ages. And Bennett is doing it in a humorous way, talking about Jamaica colonizing Britain, which is a sort of ironically humorous way to see the immigration, but it is a serious issue at the same time, because the immigrant experience was such a troubled one in Britain. Like, they did encounter a ton of racism and things like this. But the other place to which these Caribbean poets tend to relate is Africa, which is, of course, where large numbers of slaves were brought from by the British, the Dutch, the French, the Americans, and so on and so on. And a large portion of the population of most Caribbean islands is descended from slaves, including Derek Walcott, the third Caribbean poet that we're reading for this week. Walcott is from St. Lucia. I think I thought that he was from Martinique in a different video lecture. I was wrong about that. And I knew I was wrong about it at the time, but I couldn't remember where he was from. But he's actually from St. Lucia. So he wrote this poem, and Walcott is one of the most important, most influential Caribbean writers, both of poetry, plays, postcolonial theory, linguistic theory, and so on and so on. So he writes this poem, A Far Cry from Africa, talking about the ways in which he, as a Caribbean poet, brought up in a British tradition, or through a British education, is divided between his loyalties. So, I mean, initially we open up with this image of Africa. A wind is ruffling the tawny pelt of Africa. Kikuyu quick as flies batten upon the bloodstreams of the veldt. Corpses are scattered through a paradise. We've got this initial image of Africa as a space of violence, and I think this is not so much Walcott imposing this on Africa as Walcott responding to a general cultural perception. So, I mean, when this poem was written, or when this poem was published at any rate, there was, what he's referring to here with the Kikuyu, there was the Mau Mau Rebellion in Kenya, which was a very brutal uprising that was dealt with by the British even more savagely. So this was an uprising by Kenyan nationalists who wanted to establish an independent Kenya that was not part of the British Empire. And we'll see this as well when we talk about Ngugi wa Thiong'o. But Africa has long figured in the Western imagination as a space of violence, a space of death and tribal warfare and things like this. So I think that Walcott is here not imposing that image on Africa, but he's starting with it as the sort of cultural origin point that that many Western readers would already have for Africa. But what's really interesting to me about this poem is the last almost 10 lines or so, from 25 on through 39, or through 33. Sorry, there's 33 lines in the poem. From 25 on to 33, this is, I think, where we really get the meat of this poem. So this is, I'll just read this whole thing to you because it's only a few lines. The gorilla wrestles with the Superman. I, who am poisoned with the blood of both, where shall I turn, divided to the vein? I, who have cursed the drunken officer of British rule, how choose between this Africa and the English tongue I love? Betray them both, or give back what they give? How can I face such slaughter and be cool? How can I turn from Africa and live? So this is a very concise, very compact, and very well-structured statement of that self-division, that colonial or post-colonial self-division I was talking about with Claude McKay. This is the self split in two, divided loyalties between British language, literature, and culture, which has shaped a lot of Walcott, which has shaped a lot of the way he views the world, and has shaped his own thought processes, versus his African heritage, the culture of Africa, which provides the basis for so much of Caribbean culture. So this is ultimately, again, this exploration of where post-colonial subjects can find their identity. And it's a divided identity, but it's also a complex identity. So it's an identity shaped between competing cultural forces. And the way that post-colonial subjects ultimately traverse this issue, the way that they come to terms with this division, is by establishing hybrid cultures that, again, draw from both British traditions, African traditions, Caribbean traditions, Indian traditions, whatever it is. I mean, obviously, if you're Afro-Caribbean, it's British, African, and Caribbean. If you're Indian, it's British and Indian, whatever it is. Whatever it is for your specific conflict of identity, these poets, these writers, and these theorists develop new ways of being both British and Caribbean, or both British and African, or both British and Indian, or whatever it happens to be.